What makes a good person, seemingly incapable of harming even a fly, transform into a cruel monster? What has the power to push a human being beyond the limits of morality, driving them to humiliate, hurt, and destroy another? It's comforting to think that evil is confined to distant villains, monstrous creatures from movies and stories. But what if the truth were far darker, much closer, and perhaps even more terrifying than we imagine? Philip Zimbardo, one of the greatest psychologists in history, dedicated his life to investigating how extreme situations can turn ordinary people into beings capable of unthinkable atrocities. He called this the Lucifer Effect, a concept that exposes the fragility of the human spirit when faced with invisible forces, the surrounding environment, power, and social pressure. There is a phrase that resonates in our minds: if you want to test a man's character, give him power. But what would happen if you had the chance to wield total control over others? Would you remain the same person you are now, or would something dark and irreversible awaken within you, revealing a side of yourself you never imagined existed? In 1971, in the basement of Stanford University, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted one of the most controversial experiments in the history of psychology. The objective was simple yet bold: to understand the psychological impacts of power and submission. To achieve this, 24 volunteers were recruited from college students. All were mentally healthy and considered well-balanced. After being randomly divided into two groups, one assumed the role of guards, while the other became prisoners. The setting was a simulated prison with improvised cells and basic rules. At first, it appeared to be a controlled experiment, but the dynamics quickly spiraled out of control. The guards were instructed to maintain order, but were given the freedom to decide how to do so. Within days, they began exhibiting authoritarian and abusive behaviors. They imposed physical and psychological punishments, such as forcing prisoners to perform humiliating exercises or depriving them of sleep. Meanwhile, the prisoners started showing signs of extreme stress, depression, and even total submission. The experiment, initially planned to last 2 weeks, had to be halted after just 6 days. The results were shocking. Ordinary people, placed in positions of power or submission, can rapidly change their behavior and cross moral boundaries. The Stanford Experiment revealed that under the right conditions, even the most balanced individuals could transform into agents of tyranny. This became the foundation for what Zimbardo called the Lucifer Effect. The Lucifer Effect teaches us that evil is not an inherent trait of certain individuals, but rather a reaction to invisible forces shaping our behavior. Various psychological and social pressures can turn an ordinary person into someone capable of extreme cruelty. The main forces influencing such behavior include social pressure, dehumanization, and the absence of accountability. From the very beginning of the Stanford Experiment, the pressure of group dynamics and the need for conformity became evident. The guards began adopting more authoritarian behaviors simply to align with what they believed was expected of them. The pressure to act in line with other group members was a decisive factor in the onset of abuse. This phenomenon, known as social conformity, is deeply rooted in human behavior. When we are part of a group, we tend to adopt its values and behaviors, often at the expense of our own beliefs. This explains how ordinary people can be led to commit cruel acts, especially when there is an implicit or explicit expectation for the group to do so. Another central aspect that contributes to the transformation of good people into something monstrous is dehumanization. This psychological process occurs when victims of abuse are no longer seen as human beings, but as objects or even enemies. During the experiment, the prisoners were treated impersonally by the guards, being referred to by numbers instead of their names. This dehumanizing treatment facilitated abuse, as the oppressors no longer saw their victims as people deserving of respect. Dehumanization frequently occurs in contexts of violence, such as wars, genocides, and totalitarian regimes, where the other is reduced to the idea of an enemy or subhuman. Lastly, the absence of accountability is one of the strongest forces shaping cruel behavior. When individuals see themselves as part of a hierarchical structure, as in the experiment, they tend to shift responsibility for their actions onto authority figures. In the case of Stanford, the guards did not perceive themselves as responsible for the humiliation they inflicted, believing they were merely following orders. This phenomenon is known as the displacement of guilt. When we do not see ourselves as directly responsible for someone else's suffering, it becomes easier to commit abuses. These invisible forces are constantly at play in our lives, making us vulnerable to behaviors that would otherwise seem unthinkable. A central concept of the Lucifer Effect is the unique ability of power to shape and even corrupt human character. Philip Zimbardo, in observing the Stanford Experiment, noted how the guards, when vested with authority, began to exhibit tyrannical and disproportionate behavior. However, power itself is not solely responsible for this transformation. The way it is exercised and the circumstances surrounding it can profoundly affect human behavior. Power can create the illusion of absolute control over others, leading people to feel they can act without consequences. In the Stanford Experiment, the guards began to feel superior, believing they had the right to control and humiliate the prisoners. This reflects what many scholars call the disinhibition effect. When someone feels detached from the consequences of their actions, whether through anonymity or a sense of being above the law, morality starts to erode. This phenomenon is even more pronounced when power is exercised in a group setting. Group dynamics can reinforce the belief that a leader's behavior is correct, creating a cycle of destructive actions. This factor is key to understanding how totalitarian regimes and dictatorships manipulate large masses, driving entire societies to commit atrocities. Collective power, when misdirected, can transform even the kindest individuals into agents of cruelty. The famous phrase, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," by Lord Acton, encapsulates the reality observed in situations of power abuse. Throughout history, leaders placed in positions of authority have often strayed far from their initial values. What begins with good intentions can devolve into oppression, especially when power is wielded uncontrollably and without oversight. Although the Lucifer Effect was initially observed in a controlled laboratory setting, its implications extend far beyond the confines of Stanford. The truth is that evil often does not manifest in extreme or obvious ways. It infiltrates daily life gradually and silently. In everyday situations, many people who commit cruel acts do not see themselves as villains, but as ordinary individuals. The process of dehumanization, seen in the Stanford Experiment, is a phenomenon that can be observed in various real-life contexts. This ranges from co-workers behaving insensitively to more systemic forms of abuse in large organizations or governments. As cruel behavior becomes normalized, victims start to be seen as inferior or less deserving of dignity. In the corporate world, for example, some companies adopt practices that harm their employees but justify them in the name of productivity or doing their job. The increasing pressure for results, lack of empathy, and prioritization of profits over human well-being turn cruelty into an acceptable method. The dehumanization of victims, whether co-workers or other segments of society, contributes to the perpetuation of this logic. By examining how these dynamics play out in everyday life, we begin to understand that the Lucifer effect is not confined to extreme scenarios. Instead, it serves as a mirror to the subtle but insidious forces that shape our interactions and decisions, challenging us to confront the boundaries of our morality.